move this a little bit. Welcome everyone to this side event organized and convened by the Climate Action Network International and many, many partners that I'm going to be sharing with you in a moment to talk about an equitable phase out of fossil fuel extraction. Welcome all, yes, please join us. We are only starting. Yes, my name is Annabella Rosenberg. I work as a senior advisor for Just Transition with the Climate Action Network International. And we are extremely pleased to be with you all to introduce you to this major new report that you can see behind us in the screen, which is a reference framework for a fair and rapid global phase out of extraction of fossil fuels. We are going to be having today what I think is probably one of the most promising pieces of research of the many interesting reports that I'm sure you've seen during this COP. So we are extremely glad to share this with you. The way in which we are going to be working this morning, well, morning, afternoon, depending on whether you had lunch already, is that we are going to have a technical presentation by our keynote speaker, Greg Muttit, that I'm going to introduce in a second. Is then going to be followed by two of the key partners of this initiative, and then we are going to have ample time for your questions, your reactions, your comments. I also wanted to give you a heads up that today is also an extremely important day for civil society in this COP. We are holding the People's Plenary at 1 in the main plenary of the conference. And this means that this side event is going to end 5 minutes before the hour so that we can have a little bit of time to get into the People's Plenary. So that means that we are going to be releasing you 5 minutes before the scheduled time for this side event, so at 12:55. And we hope that you'll stay with us until then. Then now, I would like to ask Greg, who's already online, and you can see in that little, I would like to ask colleagues in the technical space if I can see also Greg's face and presentation in my screen here, because but I cannot see it here. Oh, there you go. So I can see also Greg's face that is already with us. And I would like to ask Greg also to put the first slide, the next one here in the screen. So maybe just say one word about the equity review project, because this is part of now a couple of years' effort across civil society to work first on an equity review of the nationally determined contributions. This is what started this project as a collaboration across multiple constituencies, of which you have some of the logos that you might recognize and some of the reports that have been produced. So this report needs also to be seen as an additional flower blooming from that garden, where now we are focusing on is on another element of equity that connects, as you know, to one of the key demands, probably the demands that civil society is making to this COP, which is the just and equitable fossil fuel phase out. So the question about how we do that with equity at the center is the one that we have tried to respond to with, of course, a very explicit request to figure out how equity fits also into a 1.5 trajectory. So next slide, Greg. This is where you can find all the reports from the Civil Society Equity Review. There have been several, all the signatories. We have now more than 200 organizations part of this exercise. And of course, you are all welcome to reach out to us if you want to be involved in this process. So I would like now to give the floor to our keynote speaker, Greg Muttit. Greg, is a very well-known researcher in the climate and energy space. He has been working on the climate and energy issues for more than 25 years. He's a senior associate to the International Institute for Sustainable Development, but also providing support and analysis for many organizations working on the fossil fuel phase out. And Greg is going to walk us through the process, the methodology, and the key results of the fossil fuel extractive equity review. So Greg, the floor is all yours, and yes, walk us through the report. Let's see if this works.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really sorry I can't be with you. I was with you in Dubai for week one, but I'm back home now. And as we've all seen, the phase out of fossil fuels has been a central issue for this COP. And from what I'm hearing, it's even more central in week two than it was in week one. And this question you see on the screen here is one of the two core questions that were asked at the Majlis yesterday, which brings equity really to the heart of the transition and fossil fuel phase out. And the reason this is important is because for some countries, it is much harder than for others to phase out fossil fuels without having severe social impacts on, for instance, workers, on government revenues, on energy supplies, and so on. And so we need to think about the different circumstances of different countries in order to find a fair way to phase out fossil fuels that takes those into account. Now, before I describe to you how we've thought about an equitable phase out, I want to say a little bit about how we're not thinking about it. Some people have talked about equity as giving every country its fair share of this benefit of extracting fossil fuels. So more of it goes to poor countries because they need it to help their development. And that's not the way we're thinking about it. And the reason we're not thinking about it that way is because fossil fuels aren't universally beneficial. They're beneficial to some people. They're very harmful to others. So, for instance, workers might benefit from fossil fuels. Governments may benefit from fossil fuels. Companies, of course, benefit from fossil fuels. But coastline communities who live next door to fossil fuel extraction experience the opposite. They experience impact on their health, loss of land, sometimes militarization, and so on. A very good example of where fossil fuels don't deliver the promised developmental benefits is the gas development happening in Mozambique over the last 10 years. And since the gas project started to get built, what we've seen there is a dramatic increase in the country's external debt. We've seen an escalation of corruption. We've seen people losing their lands, and the massive gas revenues that the government was expecting, perhaps around fairly soon, around the mid-2020s, are now being promised perhaps in the mid-2030s, maybe even later. And so it's extracting fossil fuels is not some kind of great benefit that everyone should have a piece of, and that's why we don't think about equitable phase out in that way. Instead, what we think about is the process of transition, the process of phasing out, will have an impact on people and countries who currently depend on it. So, for instance, we need to ensure that it's possible for there to be a just transition for the workforce, and so equity is really about fairly sharing the efforts and the impacts of the phase out, rather than sharing some pie that everyone would like a piece of. So let's illustrate dependence. What this graph shows you is it plots the share of government revenues that comes from oil against the income of countries. And so on the horizontal axis, there's oil's share of government revenues. And you can see some countries it's exceptionally low. In the UK and US, it's about 0.1%. In Canada, it's 1%. And these are also very wealthy countries, as you can see by how high they are in the graph. In such countries, phasing out is relatively straightforward without causing a massive impact on the economy. look at the right-hand end of the scale, you've got countries like Iraq and Equatorial Guinea, where 70%, 85% of government revenues comes from fossil fuels. And what that means is 70 or 85% of public services are provided through that oil revenue. And in addition, not only are the oil workers themselves depending on the sector, but public sector workers depend on oil revenues for their salaries. Now, if, for example, we asked Iraq to phase out at the same pace as Canada, we would have massive social impacts in Iraq as the economy tried to transition, as people were trying to find new jobs. And so, of course, what this means is countries like Iraq will need more time to phase out, and countries like the UK and Canada and the US will need to phase out more quickly. Thinking about these things, thinking about how do we fairly share the transitional costs of a phase out? In the Civil Society Equity Review, we proposed 5 principles to guide an equitable phase out. The first is that where extraction violates human rights, such as the example we saw earlier from the Niger Delta, it has to be ended urgently, immediately. It would not be a fair framework that allowed fence-line communities to continue to experience those impacts. A good example in Ecuador, a great success 3 months ago in a referendum, the Yes Unidos achieved a majority vote to end extraction where it's taking place in the Yasuni National Park with risks both to biodiversity and to indigenous communities. So where it violates human rights, where it has a grave impact on biodiversity, we need to see the most urgent phase out in those cases. As for the global whole, we need to see a phase out that is consistent with 1.5 degrees. Now that is determined by adding up all of the countries, and we really can't afford, as has been reinforced at this COP, to go above 1.5 degrees because of the extremely dangerous impacts we will experience then. Third, there has to be a just transition for workers and communities. The process has to be led by those communities, with them centrally involved in a social dialogue, and it needs to ensure that there is proper support to enable the transition and prevent the costs falling on those workers and communities. Fourth, where there is the least social cost of phase out, that's where extraction needs to be fastest, as in that graph I just showed you. And finally, fifth, the costs have to be shared fairly according to the ability of countries to bear those costs. And this means that international support needs to flow from countries with greater capacity to those with less. So we built up these principles actually over a very long period of time, involving many discussions with civil society around the world and with experts. We started work on these principles back in 2016, and many people's thinking and ideas has gone into these principles, and I think that they are quite well supported across civil society now. And what we've done in the new report, which we've released at COP28, is we've started to put some numbers to this. So how does this work in practice? How much, when we say reduce extraction fastest, well, how fast is that? And when we say share costs fairly, well, what are those costs? So that's what I'm going to share with you now. In terms of the global pace of phase out, as we've said, this needs to be consistent with 1.5 degrees. And what we've done here is we've taken one of the IPCC pathways, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. It's called the low energy demand pathway. And we've taken the total amount of fossil fuels in it, and then we've allocated that to the countries and to the 3 fossil fuels. And this is the kind of pace of phase out you can get. And as you can see, it's very rapid. By 2035, most of the global fossil fuel production has been wound down. There's only a small amount remaining. And so I want to stress here, one implication of this is it means all countries need to decrease their extraction of fossil fuels. It's not that some can increase while others decrease. The carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5 is now so limited that that all countries have to decrease. There's very strong scientific evidence now that there's no room for new oil fields, gas fields, coal mines to be developed. What differs between countries in our framework is not whether they're increasing or decreasing, because all are decreasing. What differs is how quickly they decrease. So here's a quick look at how our model works. The principles of capacity and responsibility are very well understood in climate and accepted in climate equity conversations. And these in our framework are what determine the fair shares of support for poorer countries. The newer concept in this is the concept of dependence. And we've looked at dependence in three ways, country by country. First, how much does a country depend on fossil fuel extraction for its domestic energy supplies? Second, how much does it depend on extraction for government revenues? And third, how much does it depend on extraction for jobs? We've made a composite indicator out of these three aspects of dependence. And then you see that little curvy arrow. We also take into account countries' capacity to overcome that dependence. So, for instance, countries that have higher income have more to invest in alternative sectors to replace the fossil fuel sector. And so out of these elements, we have a dependence indicator, and our phase-out timelines are based on that. So let me talk you through some of the results. We're going to look first at oil, and then we're going to look at gas, and then at coal. So this graph is just for oil. And we've plotted, as you can see, a large number of countries on it. And on the horizontal axis is what year do they effectively end extracting oil in this case. On the vertical axis is the country's capacity. Now, I'm going to say a couple of things about that. Firstly, on the end date, we need to see a rapid decrease starting now. The end date doesn't imply that if you've got a 2040 end date, you don't have to think about fossil fuels till 2040. Because of the limited nature of 1.5 degree carbon budgets, all countries are decreasing, but they're decreasing at different paces. And so we've used the end date just because it's an easy thing to picture, to imagine. And so this is an indicator of when production effectively stops. But to stress within that, there are decreases starting right now in all countries. So, and then the other thing I want to say about how this graph works, that horizontal blue line, that marks a global average per capita capacity. And in our model, every country that's above that line provides support to enable phase outs in poorer countries. Every country below that line receives support. So I'm going to talk you through some of the key countries in this. Let's start with the top left. Now, you see there the UK, Canada, the United States. In order to leave enough space for more dependent countries to take some time to phase out while achieving a just transition, those countries need to be very early. We're saying, according to our model, it's about 2031, 2032. So just 7 or 8 years from now, we need to see those countries with very high capacity and very low dependence phasing out. I've already talked about how those have low dependence. One I'm going to focus on, which is interesting, is Norway there. Now, Norway does rely more on oil for its revenues and for its jobs than those other countries. So you might think, well, Norway has a slightly higher dependence. And the reason that still ends up at this 2031 date is because Norway, as you can see, has the largest capacity of all the countries in this graph. And because it has that high capacity, it's able to overcome its dependence. And that's how it ends up with a date similar to those other countries. If we move rightwards, we see some other countries which have much higher dependence. For instance, Kuwait phasing out in about 2038, Saudi Arabia in 2042. This is because their economies are so deeply entangled with oil that disentangling them will take inevitably some time. It takes a very long time to build up alternative sectors to overcome the structural factors locking a country into dependence. But because those countries are above the blue line, we still expect them to provide support to enable transitions elsewhere. So they get more time, but they still provide support. Let's move to the bottom right of the graphic now. You see countries like Angola, South Sudan, Iraq, Equatorial Guinea. As we saw in the earlier graph, these are countries that are exceptionally dependent, where more than 3/4 of government revenue comes from oil, a very large proportion of jobs, large proportion of energy supplies, and they're also countries with very low capacity to overcome these challenges. And so what our model does is it gives them as much time as it possibly can to enable this phase out while still staying within 1.5 degrees. And that pushes them to 2050 when we need to see a global net zero emissions. And so, as I say, it does that by making other countries move earlier so that those countries have time. I think for a country like Iraq, which I know reasonably well, the economy is so fundamentally based on oil that even doing this within just under 30 years, I think, is an immense challenge, and doing it without incurring significant social impacts, both for oil workers and for public sector workers. Finally, let's go to the bottom left. These ones are perhaps the more surprising countries in here, because you see lots of countries from the global south, like India, Indonesia, Thailand, etc. Now, those countries, although they have low capacity, they have fairly low levels of dependence. They're only small oil producers, low dependence on oil. We'll come back to the other fossil fuels in a moment. And so because their dependence is low, they are able to phase out in that short time period of less than 10 years, but only, and I really stress this, if they are provided adequate support. These countries in the bottom left illustrate more than any just how important support is to our framework. It's inconceivable to ask India, for instance, to phase out, although it's only a small oil producer with a few offshore fields. It's inconceivable to ask it to phase out on that time frame without a significant amount of support from high-capacity countries. And finally, I just want to flag those green countries up in the top right. Those are countries which don't extract fossil fuels, but which still need to provide support to enable poorer countries, the countries below the line, to undergo phase out. So countries like France, like Switzerland, and so on. So that's the picture for oil. I'm going to quickly show you gas, where the picture is very similar, but you'll notice that some countries move because, for instance, Trinidad and Tobago phase out in the late 2040s, whereas for oil it was the early 2030s. That's because Trinidad and Tobago is heavily gas dependent and is not oil dependent. So we've treated the three fossil fuels separately for each country, and so they move horizontally between the three fossil fuels. And then let's look at coal briefly. Now, this is the element of the framework that surprised me the most when we got the model results, which is that coal phases out faster. In the countries that take the most time, it phases out faster than oil and gas do. So the latest phase out here we have is South Africa in 2042. Now, I think of South Africa as a country that's very dependent on coal, and the reason it ends up in the early 2040s rather than the late 2040s here is that dependence depends very heavily on coal, both for jobs and for its domestic energy supplies. But we've looked at three elements of dependence. The third is revenues, and coal is not a significant generator of revenue, unlike oil and gas. So with oil and gas, the most dependent countries depend on oil and gas extraction on all three dimensions, whereas in coal it's just two dimensions. Again, we see India here in about 2037. It's a very challenging time frame for such a low capacity and highly dependent economy. So again, it really emphasizes just the centrality of support to make this possible. So let me say a little bit about support before I finish. We wanted to quantify support because it's so central to the framework. As I've said, in some countries, a phase out just won't be possible without adequate support flowing to them. And we made a very first estimate, which is only really a lower bound, because the actual amount of support that's required to really answer that question, we would need to look country by country. There would be a proper needs-based assessment, engaging civil society and government and so on. And that assessment simply hasn't been done. There's a small number of studies trying to estimate it in different places, and so we took a few of those studies. Now, I think none of them captures all of the elements of support that are needed, but between them they capture different aspects. For instance, social protection for affected workers, or investment to build up new sectors. Because it's not complete, I think this is an underestimate of the actual amount. But this, we're fairly confident the true number will not be lower than this, about $210 billion per year. And what we did was we shared this between the countries above the line in proportion to their capacity and responsibility. And so here are the contributors of support in our framework with the share of that total that they provide. You'll notice immediately how much, that nearly half of it comes from the United States. And that's because the United States has such high capacity compared to other countries and such a high amount of responsibility for causing climate change. The European Union is also very high, and Japan, and so on. So to conclude, I want to stress again that we don't believe there is any right to extract fossil fuels, contrary to how some people talk about this. There is a right to adequate energy. There is a right to living a decent and healthy life, but there is no right to extract fossil fuels. Because fossil fuels benefit some people and harm others, and because there's very little remaining carbon budget for further extraction, fossil fuels have to be phased out as quickly as possible in all countries, beginning now. The second thing I want to emphasize is that equitable phase-out is about enabling a just transition in different countries' circumstances. As I said before, it's not about allocating some kind of, quotes, benefit of fossil fuels. And this has a bearing not just on the timeframes and the principles, but also on how we think about the flow of international support. Some people have talked about it as a compensation for countries for the fossil fuels they're not extracting. We don't take that view because we don't see fossil fuels as a benefit that needs to be compensated. I think also practically it would be extremely difficult to compensate countries for not extracting their fossil fuels. The amounts would be huge, and it would benefit some countries that perhaps don't really deserve it. It raises the question of why should countries get these large amounts of payouts just because they've won the geological lottery? So we're not thinking about support as a type of compensation. We're thinking about it as enabling funding to enable the just transition. So it's measured not by how much fossil fuel reserves a country has, it's measured by what does it take to undergo this transition. And then finally, I just want to stress again that in our framework, we see phase-out timelines and international support as inseparable. It doesn't make sense to think about phase-out timelines without thinking about what support is available to enable that. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to your questions and reactions and to the comments by the other speakers. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Greg. And I hope you can see how the audience has been engaging with your presentation, taking multiple pictures of the slides. And do know that you can download the report already in equityreview.org. You have the report, you can download. So now what we would like to do is to hear a little bit from two key partners to this initiative. As I said, we have more than 200 organizations, but these two are of a very special nature. I would like to first invite my friend Bert de Vel. He's the climate officer for the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation. Very often, unions and workers are seen or are told to be against any conversation about climate ambition. So we are extremely proud to be in this permanent conversation with the trade union movement about how we can make this just for workers. So, Beth, why joining this initiative? Why this review is interesting? Yes, thank you very much for your words.
Thank you very much, Annabella, for the introduction. And yeah, first of all, huge respect for the work of the researchers and for the group that has prepared this report. I have tried to participate in it, and I have added the just transition language, gone into discussion with you, but yeah, it's immense work, and it's at the heart of the negotiations here in Dubai, in my opinion. And this should be a plenary room, according to me, instead of you all here. So from my perspective, you understand what these negotiations are about. So first, so I'm Bert de Vel. I work for the International Trade Union Confederation. That's the big body that represents all the free trade unions, 330 members in 160 countries. And I'm the Global Climate Policy Officer Coordinator. First, closing businesses with good paid jobs is not our specialty. Yeah? I repeat it, like closing businesses with well-paid jobs, with good conditions, we're not good at that with trade unions. And second, I'm partly paid by the membership dues of people from the fossil fuel sectors. So all our members pay dues, including we represent fossil fuel workers. So this goes straight to the heart of our work. But with the trade union movement, we have taken on the climate challenge full on. So we respect, we understand the challenges that we are faced with, and we think that we are in a crucial place to deal with it. The way that we have done it since many years is through the concept of just transition. So just transition was launched in the 90s by trade union movement, trying to combine environmental protection, climate science, and social rights. Combining those two, according to us, will make it possible for solving the deal. We think that just transition can provide the necessary trust in the negotiations, in policies, to get along people in these policies that are needed. Because we are very clear about it, we are not scientists. We represent workers and we defend their rights. And the IPCC reports and all of them, this is the angle that we take. We start from the science and we want to apply it in a social way. Just transition, from our perspective, is dus double. On the one hand, dealing with the workers, and on the other hand, dealing with science on the international level. And we have read very well in the IPCC report that it says, and the IEA reports, no new unabated fossil fuels. So and this is a very strong message to our workers. How we are very happy with this report, that it picks up this just transition language to implement it in policies. And at the climate negotiations, it's not always easy for the negotiators to understand how we do it. There is words as social dialogue, social protection, stakeholder participation. These are the keys to do it. We think that trade unions that are represented at the international level in the International Labour Organization, we have, together with governments, employers, trade unions, we have developed tools to implement these policies. And since there is fundamental labor rights agreed by all governments that are in these negotiations on how to implement labor policies, and these also apply to getting out of fossil fuels. These fundamental labor rights refer to freedom of association. Like, are you as workers, do you have the right to set up a union? There are countries, we happen to be in one, where you cannot even set up a union. There are many countries where trade union people are being have a hard time from business and from governments. Collective bargaining, jointly negotiating the way that we get out of fuels. If you have to negotiate with your fossil fuel boss on your own about how you're going to get out of it, yeah, you know you're going to get nothing. So collective bargaining, workers together in a company, organized preferably on the national level, sector level, they will be able to get a fair deal in order to, and this fair deal will bring the trust in society. Social protection measures, is it something else that linked to that? Unemployment coverage, health coverage are all tools. So these are the instruments that we have and that we offer the climate negotiators, the climate people, to implement in an efficient way these policies that we all know that we need. And yeah, I think that these negotiations here are crucial to make progress on this issue in two ways. On the one hand, recognition of labor rights, and on the other hand, the crucial discussion on the international cooperation, global equity discussion for support. These two themes are now on the agenda, have been discussed in the Just Transition Work Programme, need to appear in the GST, need to appear in mitigation, and they will provide, on the one hand, phasing out fossil fuels, but on the other hand, support for this and engagement with workers to do this. So when you read the text, maybe tomorrow, maybe in the week, a few days later, you do Control F, and you put in labor rights, and if labor rights pops up, then you can be sure that we have a hook as workers, as trade unions, to engage with our governments to be involved in these policies to phase out fossil fuels. And that's what we really hope that comes out of these negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bert. And thank you for your contribution. And thank you for your support for both, the civil society, equity review that has been going on for many years now, as well as this new extraction equity framework. I would like to invite our second panel speaker, Alex Rafalovitz. He's standing here. He's a program director of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Another important support to this review has been part of these conversations, in particular Dr. Amira Savas, that has been part of the conversation. And unfortunately, she's unwell today. As you know, many people around the conference center are struggling a little bit health-wise. So we wish her a good recovery. But we are extremely glad to have Alex with us. And Alex, you have been pushing for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. What is the space for equity within that initiative? And yes, why you think this is a good idea to have an equity review?
Thank you so much, Annabella, and thank you, Bert, and thank you, everybody who is here. I'd like to start by saying that the pressure against fossil fuels may reach an irreversible tipping point at these negotiations. Who said that? OPEC. That was the president of OPEC. That is the political moment that we're in. We are facing an irreversible tipping point against fossil fuels. And it has been a struggle for many people and peoples and movements over many years to get to this point. And I think, as Greg laid out in his presentation, the amount of time that we have lost in this struggle to get to this point has meant that the action that we have to take is far more rapid and radical than it could have been. And also, just to note, Greg mentioned the lack of the carbon budget that remains. We should check where we are with the climate science, just because we're at a climate conference. So global mean temperatures are the highest on record today. Average sea surface temperature is the highest on record today. October represented the sixth consecutive month where Antarctic sea ice was at a record low, and Arctic sea ice is now 12% below average. We are living through the climate emergency. Later will be too late. And so we need to start a conversation immediately about the fast and fair and financed phase out of fossil fuels, the number one driver of the climate crisis. So as the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, we were delighted to be able to support the development of this report as a contribution to the conversation that we have to have. And that has started now, finally, in these halls. Following these negotiations for a long time, I think we can get into the trap occasionally of seeing the overarching global signals, the overarching goal saying, well, the world needs to be at net zero by 2050, or, balance of sinks and sources by the midpoint of the century, whatever the technical language is, or saying, emissions need to be reduced by at least 43% by 2030, without breaking down what that means for different countries in different circumstances. And so I think it's a really substantial contribution to have this report that can say, when we talk about phasing out the extraction of fossil fuels, what that means if we want to do it fairly and at the pace that's required, it means that there needs to be an 80% reduction in fossil fuel extraction in the richest countries. You could call them, as I think they have been called in the negotiations yesterday, the hypocrites, the ones who come here and say, we want to phase out fossil fuels, but are actually planning some of the largest expansion of fossil fuels in the United States, in Canada, in Norway, in Australia. They need to have 80% less reduction in 2030 than they have today. So that's the task before them. But because there is no carbon space left, because we are in a climate emergency now, because we are at risk of breaching the 1.5 degree guardrail far, far sooner than any of us dreaded, it also means that countries in the global south need to be, even the least developed amongst them, need to have 10% less extraction in 2030 than they have today. And that reduction represents the greatest challenge, because for the United States, for Canada, for Australia, the planned transition from extraction is not a significant hit on their economy. They have the capacity and the diversified economy and the institutional structures that will allow them to plan a shift away if they wanted to. But it's for those other countries where the international system is rigged to encourage them to continue with extraction. It's rigged by the rules of access to capital. It's rigged by the rules of the debt that they have. It's rigged by the development policies that other countries often foist upon them. So what we need to do is find a way to have a conversation about how can we change those rules so that countries can choose a development pathway not based on extraction, and particularly not based on the extraction of fossil fuels. That requires some resourcing. It will require money, technology. And I think this report does a good effort of making some estimations of what that resourcing might look like. The proposal here was to suggest that the United States could perhaps contribute at least $100 billion worth of resourcing a year to facilitate the transition. Now, $100 billion in these negotiations has taken on a monstrous figure of a huge amount of money to mobilize. It wasn't possible to do it during a whole decade of our best efforts. How much is $100 billion? It's 5 days of fossil fuel subsidies at current rates. 5 days. We're currently, according to the IMF, subsidizing fossil fuels to the tune of $13 million a minute. So in 5 days, we'll have our $100 billion to pay for the transition that we need to have. So I think what this report also helps us realize is although it is a big challenge, it's an imminently doable one. We have to find the political will to direct the resources to the transition that we want to see happen. And we also have to recognize that it is not only about the transition of the resources, but it's also about the reform of international systems, the international trade system, international intellectual property rights, and international debt systems in order to give countries the space to be able to make the choice to exit from fossil fuels. I know later this afternoon at 3:30, I think, Kenya and Colombia will be presenting on their expert panel for debt and nature, which is looking at exactly this question of how could the international debt system be reformed to allow countries to choose nature, to choose Mother Earth in their policy making. I'm going to just finish with a quote from President Gustavo Petro from Colombia, who last week endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And what he said as he did so was that he'll be accused of economic suicide for suggesting that there will be no new oil or coal extraction in Colombia. But the choice was actually to avert a real suicide, a real omnicide, the destruction of all living things on our planet. And what he said was, we have a choice between the interests of fossil capital and life. And we will choose life. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex. And I think we all here, I hope, rank with life in this room. So, friends, colleagues, this is the moment that we would like to also give you for reactions and your questions. I would like to flag that both Bert and Alex are also committed to the People's Plenary. And as I said, I mean, they have to also run some preparations towards that moment. So most of your questions are absolutely going to be answered by Greg, that is staying with me. But I would not like to make Alex and Bert feel like, I mean, when you need to leave, you can leave. And we absolutely appreciate you joining us in this conversation. So, yes, how are you feeling about this? What do you think? What are your reactions? We are going to collect a couple of questions and comments, and yes, hopefully we still have quite a bit of time for your thoughts. So I'm just checking who in the, I mean, do we have like a roaming mics around? Excellent. So I see, I mean, let me just get a show of hands. So we have 2 here, Elinor there and behind, okay? That's the order, and then we do another round. So we start here at the front, and yeah.
Yes, hi. Larry Moffat with Rise for Climate Belgium. A question for Alex. This 10% reduction proposed for developing countries, how would that affect a project like ECOP in Uganda? We know that's a climate bomb, but it's also estimated that it would contribute 20% to the country's GNP.
Thank you very much. And please follow our colleagues' lead in terms of brevity and conciseness. This is amazing. So, yes, you were in the third row. There was a second flag.
Hi, my name is Stella. I'm a student at Northwestern University and a labor organizer. My question is for anyone who can speak to it, but you've mentioned the need for political will and the coordination of labor strategy and to achieve some of these big changes. What do you think is the tactic that will persuade that political will? Is it through labor and workers themselves, or the broader public, or simply politics?
Thank you very much for that question. I saw you, but I first have to follow my line. So we had Elinor, then you, and then you at the back. So this is the order.
Thank you very much for this presentation. My first reaction, especially seeing Canada, where I'm from, on there is, does Canada know that it's being portrayed as much easier because it's making a big mountain out of it? So to whoever can answer, what's been the dissemination plan so far to governments, but also to some of our labor colleagues, and how may we be of assistance to disseminate this further?
Excellent.
Hello, my name is Marisa Coombs. I'm a graduate student at Stanford University and also a labor organizer. We recently unionized. So I'll echo the previous question is how do we rally our graduate student workers to see themselves as part of the larger picture of political action?
Excellent, thank you. And then we have a gentleman back and when we close first round, and then you are going to be first in the second round.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Pierre. I'm the MENA representative of Publish What You Pay, a global movement of civil society organizations working for a fair and just transition. My question is for Greg. How do you view or position countries which are considered potential producers, such as my country, Lebanon, in the context of fossil fuel phase out and transition, and where the government might say, well, we haven't benefited yet from our wealth, where others have done so? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So now basically, you folks can just answer the questions. I kept track, so if you forget any, I will come back to you. Alex, do you want to go first, then Bert, and then Greg?
Thank you. So I think the science is very clear on there is no space for new projects. So projects that aren't yet completed and require more investment and more infrastructure and more capital are clearly incompatible with a commitment to 1.5 degrees. But the other thing I think to recognize about new fossil fuel infrastructure and existing fossil fuel infrastructure, and this was a point I think Greg raised about risks to human rights and communities, is that often these projects are not only a climate risk, but they actually threaten every one of our sustainable development goals. They undermine local land, they undermine local biodiversity, air, water, local human rights, political participation, the rights of women. And so there are broader concerns around each individual project that I think local communities across Africa are speaking to about why they are resisting the EACOP pipeline. I think what this report does is not necessarily speak to individual projects, but speak to the broader transition that would need to happen. And I think it would be unlikely in a world where we are rapidly transitioning off the production and use of fossil fuels that there would be space for a project like that. And I think the other question that seemed most pertinent to me is around the dissemination plan. I think it's something that we hope both that there will be feedback from people across civil society about the analysis here and the assumptions and help us make it stronger, and then use it to have a conversation with various governments. And this was actually released a couple of days ago, so that I know that some people have been taking it into meetings here, and we're sorry you don't have any more printed copies, but please do disseminate it. And in the end, I think when we talk about building power to shift the politics, we build power by being in relation with one another. And so having those conversations is the first step to us building that power. So I think that will be incredibly important.
Thank you, Alex. Bert.
Okay, I will also reply to the trade union strategies to organize around this. First, I don't think there is one unique strategy to do this. Conditions are very different in different countries, in Senegal compared with Sweden. But in the end, it all comes to the same, organizing workers to pick up this issue. This is extremely difficult at this moment because in many countries you have this surge of right-wing populist governments and politicians that combine climate skepticism and anti-union tactics. So both of them are very strongly on their agenda, and they're making weaker the unions, and they're putting doubt on climate policies. And with their strong access to media, this makes it very difficult for unions to organize and to have impact. But at the same time, we have to convince people of the benefits of it. And I usually give one little example. In my country, in Belgium, the unfamous wage gap between men and women in income, in my country, in the Walloon region, this was inverse. So women were earning more than men. I don't think there's any other country in the world where women are earning more than men. And why is this? Because there is collective bargaining. So everybody that goes in a job has the same wage, and we negotiate that job, and we negotiate the conditions. So there is direct benefit if you're organized, direct material benefits on your working conditions and your pay if you organize collectively. So we have to get at the table to negotiate these things. And we call it social dialogue, with employers at the table negotiating our wages. But once at the table, we are not there for the cookies. We are there to negotiate. And you have to be power when you're at the table. And this power comes by organizing with workers, by joining civil society organizations, by going to the street, by influencing elections. The situation in the US is day and night different from before Biden, for example. Now there's a push to have these better wages. So this makes a difference, and it's also even translated here in the negotiations with stronger support for a labor language. And final point is unity. Like all workers, in unanimity behind these issues. At this moment, our friend Elon Musk has a hard time getting his Teslas into Sweden. Why? Because the postal workers refuse to send his number plates for his cards. Musk doesn't want to negotiate with trade unions in his Tesla plant in Sweden. So they went on strike. They protested against it. And they got solidarity from the postal workers that refused to send out the number plates. That's how we get power, and that's how we can make changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Bert. So, Greg, you can react on all of them, but the one that I'm missing is how we have handled the potential producers question. Like the ones that have this whole lot of plans to produce don't appear in the list because today they are not major producers, but they would like to see themselves in that table. So, Greg, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And on this, I'm going to build on what Alex has already said, that the science is clear, there's no room for this within 1.5. And also, developing new fossil fuel projects would be very harmful to the fence line communities living there. But I'm going to add to that and say it's not even a viable path to economic development for the governments, for the countries as a whole. And one reason for that is what's known as the resource curse. The vast majority of countries that have gone into fossil fuel development have not met their expectations for being better off, for gaining income and wealth from that oil or from that fossil fuel. I think every time a new reserve of oil and gas is found and a country decides to develop it, the media says it's going to be the next Kuwait. And we've had many, many next Kuwaits since Kuwait, and there hasn't been another one since. And I think part of the reason for that is the way the fossil fuel industry works, the distorting impact it has on the economy, and the dramatic increase in indebtedness that it causes for a country. And so for countries that are considering now becoming fossil fuel producers, I think there's that powerful risk of adding to your debt and holding back your economy. Now, there's an additional reason why at this moment it would be particularly dangerous to go into new fossil fuel production, which is that globally an energy transition is taking place. So not only do countries face a massive increase in their debt, but just at the time when they start getting any revenues for it, and generally it doesn't take less than 15 years, so we're talking about mid-late 2030s, usually at that point, a lot of those revenues are used to pay back the debts. But in this case, since the global energy transition is taking place, export markets are likely to dry up. And so what's going to happen to countries is not only are they going to have massive debts, but not have revenues even to pay them. So there's a real danger that countries will end up considerably worse off. I think our problem, and this goes to the other questions about how do we organize and how do we create the political will to act. I think the evidence on this, on the economic effect as well as the climate effect, is abundantly clear. But oil has an intoxicating effect on politicians. However much they see the evidence, they'll say, "Oh, but we'll get rich." And I think the best cure for that is civil society. Through the Civil Society Equity Review, we are aiming to share this around the world through our allies, through our networks, and the aim is that country by country we make it clear that fossil fuels are not going to be beneficial, and in fact need to be phased out as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much, Greg. I love that idea that we are the cure to fossil toxicity. So let's do a second round of similar sharp questions and comments. So let's just see me hands. Okay. So, and then I'm going to close the stack because we need to leave. So one here, you behind, you, and then one. Okay? So yes, we can start. Do you remember your order, huh? No, here. We can't hear. Maybe closer? No, maybe closer to. Yeah.
Like this? Okay, my name is Paula. I'm from Colombia. My question is very related to what I think to the previous questions, but I want to ask, what are concrete options on how a government like Colombia can replace the income if reducing oil extraction before our economy and energy security is in crisis, and how these negotiations are providing options for this transition.
Thank you very much. So just behind our sister, just behind you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to discuss today in these presentations. And Seydou Witherspoon with the Children's Environmental Health Network. What I'm not hearing about today is the impact of health and generation of health and how this impacts all the indicators related to the report, which I do look forward to reading, and all of our efforts forward. If we are truly talking about an equitable, just transition of many layers here, talking about the reparations, for example, and where we need to be unified, our Global South partners and all of our partners underneath that line, and a lot of those slides in the first presentation, have worked very hard on making a range of reasons, health and implications of health being one of those. I think we're making the gross assumption here that we are going to have healthy workers to even work in the future. We have generations that have been impacted, and babies being born today being impacted because of the ill results of fossil fuels. So if that is not part of the scenario, and if we're just kind of broad brushing, not supporting reparations, we are not on a good footing.
Thank you very much for that question. So colleagues here in the first row. Yes, you, and then colleague at the bottom.
Adriana from Climate Strategies, but I'm making this question more on my own personal behalf. I heard one of our panelists recently saying that the message that we are sending by hosting a COP here in Dubai is very dangerous, especially for emerging producers that basically see this and say like, okay, this is everything you could have if you continue exploiting oil and gas. Now we're looking into Azerbaijan, a similar country where we saw poverty reduction from over 50% to 4% thanks to the fossil fuel economy. So how, as a community, can we get organized early on to counter these narratives?
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Paolo from APMDD. Some of our partner countries in Asia are not on the graphs. Is there? Did you include them in the studies, and can we access the data so that we can recreate the graphs to better present to our constituents in Asia?
Thank you very much. So we're moving to this side. Just, I want to see again. So yes, you and you. Okay. And you. Okay, so these three last ones, and then we wrap. So here we have the colleague. Well, you can both take the mics so that it goes faster. So, and then you at the back. Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, Peter Thornton from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The question is whether the framework includes consideration of carbon pricing and or tariffs in the construction of the dependence and capacity.
I mean, Greg, have you managed to head, because it was very low? Maybe you can get it closer just in case.
Yeah, sure. Whether the framework.
I don't think the mic is working.
Whether the framework includes consideration of carbon pricing and or tariffs in the capacity and dependence components.
Excellent, please.
Thank you. I'm Joël. I'm from the Publish What You Pay Madagascar. So my concern is about how can we talk about equitable phase-out in context of poor countries, especially where the condition and the electrification rate is still very low and over many problems.
Excellent. And our last question behind.
Thank you. My name is Igor Makarov. I'm a climate change economist from High School of Economics in Moscow, Russia. My question concerns price, because when we discuss only phase out of fossil fuels, we consider only quantities. But the economy adjusts, and probably if the real phase out starts, so it would lead to the rise in prices. And so probably it would have some implications for the distribution of revenues. So the revenues of exporters would not decrease so much, but the additional burden would lay on importers and importing countries. So I would be grateful for your considerations on that. May it somehow be reflected in the model. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions and inputs. Extremely valuable, all of them. So let's go for a quick round. Alex and Greg, go for it.
I was just going to say that, yeah, Bert will answer that. No, that was a joke. Sorry. So in terms of the concrete options, and this also, I think, connects to the question about our COP hosts, is we undertook a study in partnership with the Third World Network looking at the experience of economic diversification away from oil in the Gulf region. It's available on our website. You should read it. And what it finds is that the first step to diversifying your economy away from a dependency on fossil fuels is admitting you have a problem. It's saying we actually want to diversify away from fossil fuels. So the first step I think that Colombia has taken is one of the most significant steps to say there is a huge risk to us to continue to be focused in this industry, which no matter if we adopt particular policies here, is already predicted to be in decline by the end of this decade. So there's a real economic risk, I think, when we talk about the counter narrative, and I think Greg really already spoke to it, which is if someone is proposing to you today that you should go and look for more oil or gas, and particularly for more coal, it's going to take 7, 9, 11 years, those are the averages, to get out there and to find the deposits and to set up the infrastructure and to dig up the product. And in that time, the market will not be there. So what will you have instead? You'll have spent almost a decade of state revenue subsidizing that activity, either through direct subsidies or through tax write-offs. And then you will have what the economists call a stranded asset, so an asset that isn't going to be returning, making returns anymore. But a stranded asset is a real asset. It's a real thing that is going to exist in the world. It's going to be in the Amazon It's going to be under the ocean in a fragile ecosystem, spewing toxins and poisons into the surrounding ecosystem, damaging the health of people and living things. And probably the workers are not going to have got a fair exit plan from that project because the corporations behind it will have created a set of shell companies and avoided liability. So there's a real economic risk around continuing to invest in fossil fuels. And I think that's part of the narrative that we need to be making clear to people. That's what the signal, I think, coming out of this COP will ultimately be, that the end of the fossil fuel era will be announced most clearly here. And that signal will have reverberations across the industry and across the planet, and that's what we need to be preparing for. And you know, the question on health, my apologies for not listing it in the impacts of fossil fuels, because it is right up there. And it is actually one of the biggest non-climate drivers for why we need to address this problem. And I think the World Health Organization has actually endorsed a call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty precisely because of that. And that question on reparations, I think there would be some who would characterize the vision in this report as a form of reparations. It's a form of looking at who has profited off the existing model and therefore who's going to make a contribution to make it right. Who is going to help accelerate the transition that we need? So that may be one way of looking at what's described in the report. But it, you know, would welcome a further discussion about what that means. I think that's probably what I should talk about.
Thank you, Alex. Greg, over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for the great questions. I think I'm going to try and answer them in the remaining ones in reverse order. Lastly, there was a question from our colleague in Moscow about, is this going to lead to a rise in prices? What we've talked about here is phasing out fossil fuel extraction. I think it's crucial that extraction and consumption get phased out in parallel and at the same time. Otherwise, it's going to lead to price effects one way or the other. So although we haven't focused on it, really the two have to be done hand in hand. And so, you know, we need to see a similar process on phasing out fossil fuel consumption in parallel. I think the transition, however it's done, is likely to see a lot of volatility in prices. It will probably see the most volatility if it's done by markets in an unplanned way. And that, of course, that volatility will have a massive impact on importing countries and on the people who suffer from energy poverty. I think probably the best way to limit that price volatility and those impacts is to have a planned and managed and orderly process, and that's part of what we're articulating here. The colleague from Madagascar talked about what do we do where there is massive energy poverty or where the electrification rate is low. I think one thing that's very clear to me is that for the majority of people who don't currently have access to electricity, fossil fuels are a very bad solution. They're centralized, they're price volatile, and the best way to deliver access to electricity to those who don't currently have it, especially in more rural areas, is through decentralized renewable energy. We have those solutions there, and what's needed is the finance and the political will to deploy them. There was a question from Paolo, I think, about some countries not on our graph. Apologies for that. We've focused on the largest producers of fossil fuels. We haven't covered all of the countries of the world. We will continue to develop this framework, and over the next year we will add more countries to it. But I'm sorry, not everything's there yet. So I think at some point in the next year, we will have that. Or if you would like to organize on this in your countries and you don't have the data from our report, please get in touch and perhaps we can work together on that. Thank you from me too for the comment about health. I mean, this is a crucial part of the picture. And in particular, we talked a bit about fence line communities. Fence line communities experience the worst health impacts of fossil fuels because they are so close to where the pollution occurs. So what we've said in our framework is that where there are human rights violations, including violation of the right to health because of that pollution, then extraction needs to be stopped urgently. But thank you for mentioning reparations, which I think I forgot to mention during this. The Civil Society Equity Review last year in 2022 had a report that focused specifically on how do we deliver support, and that includes reparations. Today I've talked much more about financial dimension of support, but there's also reparations, there's capacity building, there's removing the unfair terms of the global investment and trade and tax systems so that countries aren't held back and so on. So I'd refer you to that 2022 report. And then finally, the question about concrete options. I very much agree with Alex that the first step is recognizing you have a problem. And I think the second step is making a plan. I think I started these responses by talking about the importance of planning. I think countries that have been successful in shifting their economies away from fossil fuel development have had a clear plan and a clear strategy. Identifying the economic sectors that will replace fossil fuels and investing in them strategically, planning to ensure that there is a just transition. I think one other thing I would add to that is in that planning, it is crucial to engage a broad base of civil society in the country in articulating, identifying that plan, debating it, creating a vision for the country. So the final thing I want to say is, as I said before, I think civil society is going to be crucial in these next steps. I'm very proud to be part of a civil society effort here. I'd like to especially mention 3 people who were central to this report, which is Siobhan Carther, Tom Athanasiou, and Cece Holtz, none of whom could join us today, but played an absolutely central role. I'd especially like to thank the more than 200 organizations who signed on to this report and are helping take it out there and continuing to debate it. Also, big thanks to Bert, Alex, and Annabella, and thank you all for engaging in these crucial issues that I think are the key to moving forward on fossil fuel phase out. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Greg. Okay, so friends, maybe just as a bit of a closing for us all, I think, thank you so much for all your questions and how you engage with this report. We really look forward for you downloading and reaching also out to us. Before we do that, I just wanted to say also something coming from a developing country, but having lived for quite some time in the global north, is that there is indeed an element of domestic vision making, but there is also, when we think about the alternatives, but I think there is also the bigger picture about what is the role of developing countries, and in particular countries that are based on extraction, and not only fossil fuel extraction, I would say all extractive sectors, and what is the global division of labor? What is the role of those countries in the world, in the global economy? And I think those can look for those active on climate as a bit overwhelming questions. I mean, like, I can hear that, like, this just is too complicated. If we need to factor in social justice, if we need to factor in inequalities, if we need to factor the fact that indeed countries have been, put in this pathway of extraction for, 100 years or more, this is just too complicated. We are never going to be there. And I think it's extremely important, certainly from a Climate Action Network perspective, but even more personally, having worked on this justice element for so long, that we actually embrace the complexity of what we have ahead, because this is how actually is being felt in the real lives of people. I mean, climate is not an abstract conversation. I mean, if we are going to touch on the fossil fuel energy complex, if we are going to touch on the food and ag complex, if we are going to touch on bigger industries, we also need to start imagining how this whole system is going to change and start connecting with all movements and groups that are working on that, on financial system reform, in trying to address these big economic injustices that are today in the world. So that was one. The second one is that we are still figuring out what the distribution mechanism for this report is. So do reach out to us if you are organizing, for example, a conversation of your constituency caucus, if you are thinking about bringing together NGOs in your country, just reach out to us. I mean, of course, we have Greg, there is a team there, and also a lot of the partner organizations, and we would ensure that you also have those resources to open the conversation in your countries. I would like to end with the first idea that we put on the table that is so critical for where we are right now in COP. Phase out, and the phase out of fossil fuels that needs to be urgent, is inseparable from support. I mean, there's no way we can get that deal if we are not connecting justice with the fossil fuel phase out and trying to push and bully countries into signing for a fossil fuel phase out, taking into account all the elements that we have discussed, dependency, capacity, without any connection to support in some way. I think it's, one, not only unfair, two, unacceptable for most countries, but three, absolutely unrealistic. So we want to live this reality of a fossil fuel-free future, and that means connecting justice with the fossil fuel phase out. So thank you all for coming. We are going to leave a little bit earlier because, as you said, we have the People's Plenary, and we invite you all to join us there. And thank you so much for being so many.